Welcome to the Andy Stanley Leadership Podcast, a conversation designed to help leaders go further faster. Today, we'll address a principle that's difficult to apply, but deadly to our organizations when we fail to apply it. Andy, on today's podcast, we're going to address the messy but unavoidable issue of making tough personnel changes in our organizations.
Yeah, and you're right. This is one of those things that we hate to think about, hate to do. But if an organization doesn't handle this correctly, it can create legal problems. It certainly creates personnel problems, and eventually, ultimately, it creates momentum problems.
Right. And to help us navigate this tricky area, we've actually pulled out the big guns today on the podcast. Joining us is Rick Holliday, the Executive Director of Ministry Services for North Point Ministries.
Which basically means that Rick has a lot more experience in this than either of us do. So for the sake of credibility, we've invited Rick. And before we begin this conversation, you gave Rick's official title. Rick and I have been friends since college. We went to college together. Rick has been in a church administration role since he was, 17, 18? Yeah. So I always tell people he has more experience for his age than anybody in America when it comes to church.
That's right.
Administration, personnel, designed all our business systems, our personnel systems, our IT systems, has bought millions and millions of dollars of real estate for us, negotiated deals, dealt with contractors. It just goes on and on and on. And as a pastor, I'm so grateful for Rick because there's a whole plethora, which is a word I rarely use, a whole plethora of things that I never have to get involved with because Rick is so good at what he does. So we're thrilled for Rick to join the conversation. So Rick.
Well, thank you, Andy. That's a glowing reference. I appreciate it.
All you have to do is just turn on the news today, and with downsizing, with the economy, personnel issues they're just a matter of life.
You're right, Lane. Every organization, secular or nonprofit, faces those, whether it's the economy causing them or the performance of an individual. It's all part of being a leader if you want to maintain a healthy organization.
Yeah, and health really is the operative word, isn't it? I mean, we all want a healthy team to work with. You know, Rick, before we get to dealing with the unhealthy situations, what advice do you have for people just looking to build a healthy team?
Well, whenever we add someone to our team, we always look to see how they measure up in 4 key areas. The first is character. That is, are they a trustworthy individual? The second is competency. Can they do the thing that we've hired them to do? The third is chemistry. Do we get along with them and want to spend time with them? Because we're going to spend a lot of time with them. And fourth is culture. That is, how well do they fit into the unique cultural identity that we've established and other organizations have established, and do things that are very important to us as far as values, the practices that we have as an organization, the overall culture DNA that we have. How do they fit into there? And if we feel like if we find that person, that they're going to fit well into our organization and grow with us.
And whereas every organization has culture, every organization's culture is a little bit different. And for us, there are some specific lifestyle things. A big value for us is small group. So, being in a small group isn't part of a job description, but if we're interviewing somebody who has the other 3 and they say, but I don't really think the small group thing works for me and my family, that would be a negative, even though it's not part of a job description. Right. So for us, I think for a lot of nonprofits, the culture thing flows beyond the walls of the business into an individual's lifestyle, which can be tricky.
And as Rick said, that kind of sets us up to have both healthy relationships and healthy growth, which, Andy, actually, it's sometimes growth is what leads to personnel issues.
Yeah, it's not always problem people or people who are, as Rick said, incompetent or lack character. As every growing organization, for-profit or not-for-profit, has experienced, jobs can outgrow people just like people can outgrow jobs. John Maxwell told me a long time ago when we began our organization, he said, Andy, the people that start with you won't necessarily be the people that finish with you. There are starters and there are finishers, and as culture and as organizations change, sometimes you got to make tough decisions as it relates to personnel. And for a founder, for those of you who are listening who are founders, whether you founded a business or you're in a family business or you're a church planner, this is really tough because you're so incredibly grateful for those people who paid the price to help you get started. But then time goes by, and it's not a fit, and that makes for a really, really difficult transition sometimes, and that's why we're talking about this.
Yeah, and it's really, for those of us, especially in church world, it really applies beyond staff.
Yeah, in a volunteer-driven organization, this is really tricky. And for those of you in the for-profit world, imagine this. I mean, you've hired people, you've paid people, and then you have to let them go or transition them out of a position. Imagine in our world where we have, in our case, thousands of volunteers, and we are so volunteer dependent independent. From time to time, a volunteer role will outgrow a volunteer. Now, you talk about a difficult discussion. That's a difficult discussion.
Wow. Firing an employee is hard enough, but firing a volunteer, I mean, that's pretty tough.
Yeah, you sit down with an individual and you say, thank you so much for giving your time to this position or to this role in our organization, in some case for years, and thank you for giving your time, and thank you for donating financially to this organization to create a volunteer position that we don't think you should be in anymore.
Right.
It's just awful. But, as we coach church leaders, if you're not willing or able to have those conversations, you really put a lid on your growth, your development, and sometimes the maturity of the organization.
Yeah, and a lot of times leaders will make a really bad decision. Instead of dealing honestly with the person, they'll just work around them.
Yeah, we're going to talk about this a little bit later as it relates to for-profit. But in volunteer world, to work around a volunteer is dishonoring to the volunteer, even though we feel like we're doing them a favor. And it slows everything down. And eventually, and everybody listening to this podcast who's an employer can understand this, eventually you just get mad. You don't want to, and really the person you're mad at is yourself because you didn't make a tough call, you didn't have a tough decision, but unfortunately, we emotionally and I think internally begin to vent internally toward that person that we haven't had the conversation with. So it's just better to have those difficult conversations up front.
Yeah, and Andy, when a leader faces this situation, there's a very powerful, but again, difficult principle that we have to apply.
Yeah, this whole conversation really boils down to this one simple idea. You always sacrifice the one for the many and never the many for the one. You always sacrifice the one for the many, never the many, M-A-N-Y, the many, for the one. And our gut reaction, especially I think in church world, is to, in our desire to be compassionate, in our desire to be good Christians, to be good Christian leaders, to be pastors, to be whatever our role is, that our natural inclination is, I'm going to carry the one, but ultimately I may sacrifice the many. The many may be a team, a division, a department, or an entire organization.
Well, Andy, when it comes to, basically firing someone or even reassigning someone, I think the difficulty is that it can appear to be insensitive or even heartless.
Yeah, but again, as we know when we look back on these situations, it's insensitive either way. I'm going to be insensitive or seemingly insensitive to one, or I'm going to be insensitive to the many. So there's a tension either way you go. You're going to carry one tension that you grow to resent, or you're going to deal with the tension up front, move past it. And as we talk about in a few minutes, there's things you can come back around and do for individuals that have had to be reassigned or let go. So you just have to decide up front, I'm never going to sacrifice the many for the one. I'm always, if there needs to be a change, to sacrifice the one for the many.
Andy, we use good to great a good bit, and that reminds me of a quote from Jim Collins when he's talking about a Wells Fargo executive, and he says, the only way to deliver to the people who are achieving is not to burden them with the people who are not achieving.
Yeah, it's the other one that we always talk about from there that Collins actually wrote. It said, letting the wrong people hang around is unfair to all the right people, as they inevitably find themselves compensating for the inadequacies of the wrong people.
Right. And again, it's our natural inclination is I'm going to carry the one because I forget that I'm actually going to penalize the many. And again, sometimes that's clear. Sometimes an organization, I think we've been guilty of this, we become so accustomed to carrying someone. We make excuses for them in our heart, then we make excuses for them in meetings. Everybody kind of knows, well, she's whatever, he's whatever. And again, without making a conscious decision, we carry that person, and over time potentially sacrifice the integrity of the organization and, as we'll talk about, rob an opportunity from somebody else.
And Andy, as you said earlier, this could actually destroy an organization.
Yeah, in fact, the higher up a person is in the organization, the more influence they have. And consequently, when you're carrying someone who's, over division or department or a campus or a franchise, again, the more people that report to them, the more people are being penalized for not dealing specifically with the individual. And, for family-run businesses, this is a huge issue because it's family. I'm going to have a tough conversation, then I'll see you at Thanksgiving or Christmas. This is why companies set rules about hiring family and who reports to who. In our particular situation, we've had situations where we knew the personal struggles of an individual because they're part of our church. And so we know this is a single mom. We know this family family is struggling because of a health issue. We know this person just lost their mom 3 weeks ago. So we have all that information. And so our inclination, again, is to factor that in to a business environment. And if we're not careful, our hearts will be right, but our decision will be dead wrong, and will penalize the entire division, department, or organization.
Yeah, Andy, you're exactly right. And both of you will remember we had an example a few years ago with a staff employee in a fairly significant role who had an abuse issue and went through an issue, and we had strike one, and we took some pretty severe steps, and then your department, you took some extraordinarily compassionate steps to give this person the time they needed. We even invested in his rehabilitation because extremely competent. Everybody loved working for this guy, but go ahead. Absolutely. And so when we let him back into his role, and he actually resumed his leadership role in the position because we took him out of a pure leadership role for almost a year. And then he emerged back into a leadership role and unfortunately fell victim to abuse again. And this time we had told them the consequences would be dire if that happened again, and we actually had to let the person go. And yet, after he had some time to process, he actually took time to write us a very compassionate letter saying that act of walking with him and then letting him go brought him to deal with his circumstances in a way that he might not have done otherwise. So it was difficult.
I still have that letter. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's one of those letters as an employer you get through and you think, was this the right thing? Was this the right thing? Oh, it was the right thing. But in the middle of it, it's just agonizing. And again, as a pastor, for our pastors out there, his wife and children attend here. So, on a Friday we say you don't work here. Sunday he shows back up for church to be, quote, comforted through job loss. It's so extremely complicated. But your team handled that extraordinarily well.
And Andy, as painful as going through that process is, when we don't act, we really set the person up to be dishonored, to really have a painful situation that just goes on and on.
Yeah. It's like finding out someone's been talking about you behind your back. I mean, whenever you're let go from an organization, you realize, okay, while I've been doing my Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday job, there have been meetings about me. And that's a terrible, terrible feeling when you just feel kicked in the gut. They walk in and you realize I've been the point of conversation. So to allow that to go on week after week, month after month, in some cases year after year, it is extremely dishonoring to the person that you're letting go. It's humiliating when they find out, but it's just extremely dishonoring to them. So in a culture, in an organization where we say people really matter, and in our case we say people matter to God, that this is my brother, this is my sister, this is someone I'm going to spend eternity with, potentially, then and then when you ask the question, what's the most honoring thing to do for that individual? Well, the most honoring thing to do is to be extremely transparent, to tell them everything you can tell them as soon as you can tell them. And again, there are legal ramifications sometimes, there are relational ramifications, but at the end of the day, to say, I want them to know everything I know, and I want them to know everything that's been said as soon as possible, because that's what's honoring for them. And once we get through the pain, and once they look back on this situation, they may not agree with our decision, but hopefully they'll say, you know what, but they handled that as well as it could be handled.
Yeah, and Rick, fortunately, it doesn't always end in termination.
No, you're right. One of the great celebrations that we have around here is whether a person, we ask them to seek another role, or whether they decide on their own that a job's outgrown them and they've just gotten to the point where they aren't as competent as they used to be in that role. They move on to another role. And then to see them actually blossom in that role and feel like they've been invested in enough by the culture that we have here, that they actually are more successful in that new role, that's a win for us organizationally. And I would say even if they move on to another organization and use the skills that they have developed while they're in our care, that's a win for us, because this really is all about God's kingdom, not about just our organization.
And the thing is, as we said earlier a little bit, the longer we keep them in a wrong role, or a role where they're not productive or producing, we're really robbing them of whatever is coming next. Diane Grant, my assistant, says this is what we do sometimes is we free their future. I'm letting you go, I'm freeing your future, because there's something out there where you're going to be happier, you're going to be more productive, you're going to feel more successful, and by freeing your future, I'm creating an opportunity for someone else. And again, it's only funny when it's not you. But as I think about the jobs that I have lost and been moved out of, it freed my future. What came next wasn't necessarily bad. It was just different, but it just doesn't feel good in the moment. But the longer we drag it out, the longer we talk behind someone's back, the longer we carry someone, again, as we said, it's dishonoring to them, it hurts the organization, and it potentially robs someone else of an opportunity. But if you violate this principle, if you sacrifice the many for the one, basically everybody loses. But if you sacrifice the one for the many, ultimately everybody wins. The organization's stronger, that individual finds a different place in the organization or a place where they can be successful. It's the best case scenario for a win-win. But if you carry someone, if you work around someone, or if you just prolong the agony of carrying someone, again, you get mad, they know, and eventually it becomes a lose-lose. And I think, too, intuitive individuals, they know when they're not being successful in an organization. They know when they're being worked around a little bit. They know when they're not invited into the conversations. People sense that. Those things are always telegraphed. They're always telegraphed. And most of the time, an individual can pick up on that. So again, it just creates a dynamic that's unhealthy for everybody involved.
Andy, you addressed this a little bit earlier on, but talk about the aftermath, because I think it's the aftermath that really keep leaders from even going down this road.
Right. And my response to this is clearly industry specific for us, but I definitely think there's takeaway for the for-profit world. And I say that because we've seen so many of our church members who've lost their jobs. When you hear their stories and you hear how their company handled it, you just think, are you kidding? I mean, did they trust you so little that in breaking the professional relationship, they had to break off all relationships? And I don't want to be naive. I know there are industries where that's necessary, the banking industry. In many cases in the financial industries, there are just some security issues. But whenever possible, ending a professional relationship does not mean you have to end a personal relationship. And I think if employers at any level of the organization can find ways to maintain over time, again, we're not going to be best friends and hang out and go to ball games together, but to assume that because we've broken a professional relationship, it thereby means this has to be the end of a personal relationship. I think everybody listening knows, yeah, there's something wrong with that. I think the other thing for churches to keep in mind is that removing a paycheck doesn't always mean we have to remove financial support. And we've had situations before where, because we have, benevolence is part of what a church does. And even though that can be awkward as well, I think sometimes we should be pretty intentional about saying, okay, we realize, switching hats for just a minute, this is going to create a hardship. We're not abandoning your family just because you no longer work for the church. And again, that doesn't make people smile. That's not, oh, I feel so relieved. It's not meant to do that. But it's to remind them, we are still for you. You just can't work here anymore. And we've had people circle back around 2 or 3 weeks later to realize, you know what? Unemployment isn't going to carry me. We're having a difficult situation, and we welcome them back into that circle because, again, we're not walking away from them, or that's not our intent, although it always feels that way for the moment. So I think whenever an organization, for-profit, not-for-profit, can somehow show support for a family, if they can work that out legally, I think that's a good thing to do.
I think one thing we've done pretty well is to divorce the fact that someone is our employee from the fact that someone's a church member. And it is awkward, but is imperative to allow a person not to no longer work for our organization, but to then show them support as we would with any other unemployed member of our organization. Right. And you've been very kind and generous in doing that. And I think we've looked for unique circumstances and ways to help people and be creative, as you said, look to what their family needs are and help them in various ways. And those differ from organization to organization, but we can show grace in someone's severance, and some people need more help. Some people move straight into other employment, and they don't need as much help. We just have to look at their individual unique circumstances. I will say most organizations, I think, fall into the trap of it's emotionally easier to let someone go and cut off all ties with them.
Much easier.
And I think that is the mistake. That's what you don't want to do. You want to do the hard thing and do what's best for the organization, but then also do the hard thing and do what's best for that individual in taking care of them as a ministry. And
making that first follow-up call is so difficult, we don't do it. We put it off, and then we put it off so long, then it's really awkward. That first call where you call them, they pick up the phone, and you don't know anything else to say but, how are you doing? and you deserve to hear, how do you think I'm doing? You just fired me. But you know what? When you think about what do you want to look back on, I think we all want to look back on, I didn't know exactly what to do, but I wanted that person to know I still think about them, I'm still concerned about them, and I'm willing to risk some awkward conversations to make sure they know what happened professionally is not necessarily a reflection of what has to happen personally, even though sometimes it does. But I tell you, those are just tough phone calls to make. But I think great leaders make them, and I think ultimately, bridges don't get burned, and sometimes things work out later on because we're willing to reach out and do that take that unnecessary step.
And I don't want people to think that we don't take some of the normal precautions that people take in industry, and that is there are severance agreements and there are legal issues to be considered and there are no-nos for subjects that we do not talk about and subjects that we're very careful about how we talk about. However, all of that, as Andy said, is always delivered in the context of a relationship with a person, not just how to protect ourselves legally. We're also looking for how do we protect the spiritual health of the individual as well. And that is a tension that we must manage, especially during that end stage of a person's employment with us.
Yeah. But then again, going back to the original statement, it's far easier to minister to them than it is to employ them. As Andy, I've heard you say many times, you have a ministry, you don't hire one.
Right. And of course, that has a lot to do with the interview process. You meet people in the interview process who you think, this person, quote, needs a job or this person needs us. And I say, wait. Okay, we're in the ministry. We have a ministry. Let's try not to hire a ministry. Now, if somebody is an employee and they need ministering to, we are so all over that. But in terms of the process itself, we want to hire as healthy individuals as possible.
Right. So, Rick, in your experience and as we just sort of look back over the years, what are the warning signs that you look for when it comes to needing to make these kind of personnel changes?
Well, there's several ones. I suppose the one that leaps to mind, first of all, is job performance. If a person starts to perform poorly, oftentimes, as Andy said earlier, they know that. They start to disengage from the team because they aren't performing at the same level as everyone else. And so I guess when you see obvious signs of poor job performance or someone distancing themselves from the team, that's an obvious red flag. One of the things we've added in our workplace is a process we call the PDP, Personal Development Plan, and it's an opportunity for managers and employees to have a discussion. It's not an opportunity for managers to berate employees about their performance. It's not an opportunity for employees to tell them the manager everything is wrong with them, but it's a way to have an honest conversation about the hopes and dreams and aspirations of the employee, for the manager to tell the employee how they're doing and room for growth. And if we have a regular conversation in some areas of our organization, that's quarterly, some it's twice a year, some it's once a year, but it's a way for there to be a candid, structured conversation where both parties get to speak to each other honestly about what's really going on. And we found that conversation can solve a lot of future problems by heading them off at the pass.
And it forces non-relational people to be relational and talk about things that, frankly, they're just difficult to talk. They're always difficult to talk about. But when it's on the calendar, everybody knows, okay, put on your big boy pants.
Mm-hmm.
We've got to talk about the stuff that nobody wants to talk about.
Yeah, well, Andy, obviously everybody has a bad day from time to time, even a bad performance evaluation from time to time. But talk to our listeners about how you personally sort of gauge that time when it's really just time to sacrifice the one for the many.
I don't know of any scientific way to do this. I think for me, it's a nagging suspicion. You just get a sense, and I've learned for me personally not to always trust those. I've been wrong at times, but in terms of looking back and asking the question, when we look at people who did transition out of the organization, generally speaking, there was just a sense of, going back to what Rick said at the beginning, they're performing well, but it's culturally, I just don't think it's a fit. Stylistically, don't think it's a fit. Chemistry, they're just not functioning as a part of a team, which again becomes a drag on a team. It can be personality, but oftentimes it is performance. So there's sort of that nagging suspicion. Then for me, in our management team meetings, there's just four of us. That's when I'll say, hey, Rick or Bob, how's so-and-so doing? I don't have any empirical data. And sometimes it's, they're knocking it out of the park. I'm like, okay, never mind. But, when they look at me and say, yeah, we've been having discussions. Sometimes as the boss, I have the unenviable task of sort of pushing that process along. I'm saying, I recognize by the look in their eye, they've kind of made up their mind. They're just putting it off. And then I have to say, okay, let's not violate our own principle. If we know, they need to know. And if we're confident, then let's have the conversation. Let's don't say one thing and do something else. So for me, again, oftentimes, and part of that's because of where I'm in the organization and I don't have personal interaction with that many people. It's just sort of that, hey, I was talking to her and what's going on? Is everything? Because again, sometimes people have a bad day, but sometimes, it's a trend.
Andy, I often think back on the two questions that we often use, again, from good to great, when he said that, first of all, would I hire this person again? And then the one I think that is really telling is, if she or he quit, would I secretly be relieved?
Yeah. And the answer to that question immediately. And again, going back to what we said earlier, how would you like to be that person? I mean, if you knew, if anyone who worked for me knew that I would go home and say to Sandra, if Lane or Rick resigned, I'd be secretly relieved. If you knew that I thought that or said that, what would you do? You'd resign. I mean, maybe
eventually.
Not immediately. Yeah.
After negotiating a severance package.
I could talk to Rick.
Yeah, churches don't, just for our listening audience, the golden parachute in a parachurch organization or church is full of holes. So but the thing is, you would not want to stay in an organization where you felt that, if you had any sense of self-respect. So consequently, when we know, I would be elated, secretly celebrate if somebody resigned. It's time to have a conversation.
Well, Rick, as we wrap up today, just any closing thoughts?
Well, as we talk about the difficult topic of potentially removing someone from our organization, I think it's wise to keep in mind that we always want to be relational, even in the process of terminating someone. And by that, I mean, I hope that all of us, whether we work in the secular field or in a church, when we see that person on the street or at the grocery store that we used to have a work relationship with, that we can walk up to them and genuinely ask, as Andy said earlier, how are you doing? And want to know how we can help and have a relationship with them, because that's way more important than, in most cases, the job that we do.
The only thing I would add as we wrap up is this should be hard. This should be agonizing. This should keep us up at night. These should feel like the worst days of our lives, because we're dealing with individuals, their futures, their kids, in our cases, their children's attitude toward church, their spouse's attitude toward church, their neighbor's attitude toward church. And if ever this should be handled as well as it can be handled, I think it should be the local church. But also I would say that even when you do it as perfectly as it can be done, it's always gray. There's always something you should have said, always something you could have done better. Somebody's going to be angry. Either you're going to be angry because you waited too long and you're going to over-communicate. They're going to be angry because it took them by surprise. And in an ideal world, no one should ever, ever, ever be surprised they're being let go. They should have been warned so many times. And again, one of those conversations we skip is the conversation that says, now let me be real clear. If this doesn't change, you can't work here anymore. It's so hard to get those words out of our mouths. But if we've done this correctly, then when we sit down with somebody and lay those charts out and those goals out and the notes from the previous conversation and say, remember when I said if you don't, you can't. But so consequently, we should set this up so well that there should be no surprise. But as we all know, even when you've said that, people are still surprised, because it's amazing how people filter that part of the conversation out. If you don't, you can't work here anymore. So the bottom line is, even when you do this well, you're going to feel like you didn't do it well, but it's necessary. And to our church leaders, this is extraordinarily important for us, because we believe that what we're doing is the most important thing in the world. And that, yes, the livelihood of that individual hangs in the balance, but we also believe the livelihoods, the eternity, the emotional health, the spiritual health, the health of families hangs in the balance of us having great, well-led, well-staffed organizations. So, again, it's supposed to be hard. There are right and wrong ways to do this, and when it feels hard, it's because it is hard.
If you want to hear more from Andy on staff leadership, check out the Becoming a Great Staff DVD on northpointstore.org.